Part of our role as teachers is to be learning therapists who help our students diagnose barriers to learning and then develop effective treatment plans to become better learners.
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with a veteran educator and teaching mentor, your host, Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I talk about pseudogenes, the relationship of podcasts and sleep, and I continue with part 2 of our discussion of flashcards. Way back in the olden days, specifically 1977. That's when I was a college freshman, so yes, indeed, it was the very olden days. There were 3 scientists in Europe. Their names were Jack, Miller, and Brownlee, and they proposed the term pseudogene for a sequence of repetitions of about 700 base pairs in the 5S RNA gene of African clawed frogs that are not really part of the functioning gene. These scientists suggested that the pseudogenes were probably evolutionary leftovers and they have no function. Over the decades since then, many more pseudogenes have been discovered. At the last count, there were somewhere around 10,000 of them that have been identified. A common working definition these days is that a pseudogene is a region of the genome that contains one or more defective copies of a gene. So the name pseudogene, which remember we went over in the word dissection segment of the preview episode number 59 right before this full episode, and then we said that it literally means false gene. So that seems to fit pretty well, right? It's kind of like a gene, but it doesn't work. So yeah, it's a false gene. Good name, right? Yeah, well, it turns out maybe not so much. I guess that's a risky run when you're the first to name something. After all, your discovery is, well, new, and there hasn't been a lot of time and effort put into multiple studies and multiple applications of this new discovery that you just made. And you don't have the benefit of hindsight because that can only happen in the future. And here you are in the present. Nor do you have access to all those amazing new technologies that are yet to be invented. So then later on, your carefully crafted new term may turn out to be misleading, or perhaps even false. So it's kind of ironic that a recently published perspective article in Nature Reviews Genetics suggests that the term pseudogene may be, well, false. That is, pseudogenes may really be doing something, and maybe they aren't functionless. It's not false at all, at least in terms of whether it has a function or not. The authors of this new perspective aren't just trying to play a gotcha game with their article. If the original hypothesis of no function for pseudogenes had turned out to be true, then it would have turned out to have been a great name. But as it turns out, it's not true that all of these odd regions of the genome don't do anything. Well, okay, that's somewhat arguable. Functioning pseudogenes may not have the obvious and direct functions that true genes do. But this perspective article suggests that maybe we should stop thinking of them as entirely functionless. Some pseudogenes function by influencing chromatin structure in ways that regulate gene expression. There are other pseudogenes that play a role in some human diseases. One of the first functions of pseudogenes ever discovered involves inhibition of the gene for neural nitric oxide synthase in snails. In this perspective article, they have a table of a whole bunch of different pseudogenes and what their functions are. Another of the many things that the authors bring up in this perspective article is the possibility that pseudogenes may be a repository of genetic information that may add the genetic redundancy and resilience needed for evolution. They give the example of 36 human protein-coding genes that were formed from pseudogenes, or at least we think they were formed from pseudogenes, during evolution after we diverged from other primates. Now, all this talk about evolution reminds me. Don't forget that book I recommended back in the preview episode number 32, written by my friend Jonathan Losos. It's titled Improbable Destinies: Fate, Chance, and the Future of Evolution. You might want to move that book up a little bit higher on your reading list. It's a great set of stories that lay out some really cool contemporary ideas about how evolution works. But getting back to this perspective article on pseudogenes, a main point that this article is trying to make is that the term pseudogene may be misleading. And that pseudo part may also give a negative connotation. Yeah, false. I mean, that's kind of negative, right? False. I mean, that's almost literally negative. So it's not only misleading, but it has this negative connotation. So both of those aspects have probably already slowed or delayed the start of intense investigation of pseudogenes. Why waste time and effort on things that are false and functionless after all? I think that as an A&P teacher, I ought to be careful when I talk to my students about pseudogenes. If I use a classic definition that emphasizes their lack of function, am I unintentionally setting up a barrier for my students? I mean, if we're discovering various functions of pseudogenes, some of which may turn out to be central to processes my students will be dealing with in the future, won't it be easier for them to understand if I start them out with a broader, more accurate concept of the pseudogene? Now, I have a link in the show notes and the episode page at the approfessor.org/59 that links to this article. I recommend you read it. It's not very long. Because you want to both learn some facts about what we know about pseudogenes and what we don't know about pseudogenes, and to consider the interesting arguments that the authors are making. By the way, they don't really come out and suggest an alternate name. Maybe they're afraid of coming up with the wrong name that it's going to be attacked or argued against in some later decade. I don't know, but it seems to me that their main purpose is to state that this is a discussion worth having. Isn't that great when we do that in science? I just love the way science works. Don't you? A searchable transcript and a captioned audiogram of this episode are funded by AAA, the American Association for Anatomy, at anatomy.org. Did you know that if you're already a member of HAPS, you can get a deeply discounted membership rate with AAA? Now's a great time to join, too, with all kinds of new and exciting resources and activities available to help you in teaching anatomy. Just go to the new website at anatomy.org to find out more. I have an analogy for pseudogenes that I've used for a long time, and it is compatible with the contemporary ideas about what pseudogenes are, or junk DNA, if you want to call it that. And the analogy involves my garage. In my garage, I have a pile of scraps of wood, that some of which I've had in there for decades. As a matter of fact, some of them go way back. My father was an amateur woodworker, and he did a lot of projects. I kind of caught the bug, but I don't do as much as he did, partly because I spent my spare time doing podcasting. But when he passed away, I inherited all of that junk wood from his garage. That was one of the first things my mom did as she was clearing things out after my dad died, was to get rid of his junk in the garage, and I inherited the wood bits. And I keep them for the same reason that he kept them. That, yeah, they appear to be trash, but he and I never threw them away because you just never know when you can reuse them. And what these bits of wood consist of are things that were maybe mismeasured. They were cut wrong. They're still good pieces of wood. They just weren't usable for that project. So they're defective in some way. They might even have a ding in them or some other imperfection, but some part of it could be salvaged maybe for some other project in the future. So why throw it away? Because, wood is expensive, especially certain kinds of wood. And if they can be reused, why not have them available? So when you're in the middle of a project, you don't have to stop and then go to a supplier and buy a larger piece of wood than you need, when here you could have a little scrap that could be used. And so that's a lot like what junk DNA is. It probably was used at some time in the past. It became defective, and yet our genome has hung on to it. And maybe it has some current use that we can make of it. For example, those little scraps of wood in my garage, I do use them in real time sometimes to prop up something else, or, maybe put it under some piece while I'm staining it, because I don't really care whether it gets stain on it because it's just a junk piece of wood. Or I might use it underneath something when I'm drilling so that I don't drill into the work table that I'm using. So it does have a function. It's not a very obvious function necessarily to someone looking in from the outside. And isn't that what we are when we're looking at the genome? We're outsiders looking in, trying to figure out what's going on. And why is there all that junk? Just like when I open my garage door, you might look inside and say, why does he have all those scraps of wood piled up there? Actually, they're kind of organized. They're not exactly a big unorganized pile, but it might look like it at first glance, just like pseudogenes, just like junk DNA looks like junk. It looks like useless stuff piled up all over the place, and yet it might have a use, or it might have a use sometime in our evolutionary future. It's not a perfect analogy, but like any analogy, it might sort of trigger some thinking in the student to make the abstract concept of pseudogenes a little more real for them. And the reason I'm sharing it with you is, you can borrow it if you want, or more likely, it's going to trigger some idea for some analogy that works better for you and for your students. So take it or leave it. Or just think of it as junk. I don't know, whatever. The free distribution of this podcast is sponsored by the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction, the HAPI degree. When's the last time you had a thorough review of all the core concepts of both anatomy and physiology? Or comprehensive training in contemporary teaching practice? Check out this online graduate program at nycc.edu/HAPI. That's HAPI. Or click the link in the show notes or episode page. There's always a new cohort forming, so now's a good time to check it out. Do you have trouble getting to sleep at night? A lot of people do. I don't. I'm kind of well known among my family and friends to be able to sleep almost anytime, anywhere. I mentioned in the previous episode, I think it was the previous episode, that I've led a lot of overseas study tours. Guess what? I found out that some of my frequent travel companions used to take bets on whether I'd be asleep before the plane left the ground. The safe bet was that I would be. But I do know that insomnia is common and can have some dramatic effects on our overall health, including our ability to focus, to think, to teach and learn, and just generally function cognitively when we're awake during the day. About 15 years ago, a study in the journal Sleep Medicine showed that white noise can help people sleep by reducing arousals from sudden or jolting ambient noises by filling in the gap between the high and low volume noises that's in the environment around them. And that gap is filled in with a mix of frequencies that are not arousing. This can be as simple as using a fan, or can involve so-called white noise machines that offer a choice of different sounds, such as, ocean waves or rain or some other soothing sounds that have a mix of frequencies. But you know what else can help sleep? Podcasts. Yeah, that's right. In fact, there are now some podcasts with the main purpose of helping you sleep. Probably the most well-known is one called Sleep With Me, which has been around for about 6 years and has become wildly popular to help people get to sleep. In case you're wondering, yes, of course, I have a link to this podcast in the show notes and the episode page at theapprofessor.org/59. But you know what other podcasts can help you sleep? Yeah, you know. This podcast. You know that, or at least suspected that, for some time now, because you've dozed off while listening to an episode, right? Or maybe you've dozed off to 2 or 3 or 10 episodes. And that's okay. My purpose in doing this podcast is to help my colleagues. And if putting you to sleep is how I can help you, then I'm glad for it. Mostly. Well, kind of glad for it, at least. But the thing is, almost any podcast can help a person sleep. Some sleep experts have hypothesized that because a podcast is interesting enough to get your mind off of all those recurring thoughts in your head that are keeping you from dozing off peacefully, it can be an effective sleep aid. And it helps if the podcaster has a calm voice and is focused on speaking directly to the listener. Well, check, and check. It helps if the podcaster has an empathetic or kind affect. Because if you get mad while listening, it'll prevent you from dozing off, because that's arousing when you get mad. So, yeah, check again. And it works best if the content is rather bland or technical or blah. You know, such as droning on and on about pseudogenes or white noise. Okay. Yep, check again. So this podcast kind of checks off all the characteristics that a podcast should have if it's going to be a good sleep aid. Of course, you have to be ready for sleep. You have to be tired, in a relatively comfortable situation, and well, you know, just generally ready for sleep. That is, ready if it were not for all those thoughts that are keeping you just aroused enough to find that falling asleep is difficult. One thing that can ruin a podcast for sleep inducement, though, is an occasional loud sound. Oops. Oh man, that sudden burst of drums and guitar at the end of each segment that transitions us to the next segment? Whew. That might be what wakes you up. So, maybe this isn't the best podcast for falling asleep after all. Okay, I realize I may have already lost you to sleep by now. Well, that's okay, because marketing support for this podcast comes from HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. Hey, if you're thinking about going to the HAPS annual conference next May in Ottawa, and why wouldn't you be thinking about that? Don't forget that you have until February 21st to claim an early bird discount on the registration fee. And by the way, February 21st is also the same deadline for workshop and poster proposals. So go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. That's HAPS. I think I'm going to talk about flashcards again. Partly because I said I would in the last episode when I explained that I have a lot more to say about flashcards, but also partly because I just really believe in the effectiveness of flashcards for learning A&P, and I've seen so many A&P students benefit from their use over the nearly 4 decades that I've been teaching. Now, if you haven't listened to episode 58 yet, where we did part 1 of flashcards, or you need some refreshing because it's been a while since you listened, I strongly recommend that you hit pause right now and review episode 58 first. I'm going to be referring to some specific comments from episode 58 So it's probably in your own best interest to get refreshed before continuing on here. And before I continue, I also want to point out why I'm spending so much time talking to you, a teacher, about something that students should be hearing. One reason is that, as the AP professors that I've mentored already know, I think one of the central roles of A&P teachers is to help students improve their learning skills. I'm not a believer in the "they should already know how to study before they get to me" philosophy. When teaching secondary or community college A&P, well, it doesn't take any effort at all to see that many students do not know how to learn effectively. But this idea becomes downright dangerous when teaching upper division courses, especially at competitive admission universities, or in graduate courses, or in medical or other professional level programs. It's dangerous because we're more likely to believe that our students are really good at learning because, well, they got this far, didn't they? I don't care which population of students I teach, and I've taught all those populations I just listed. I know that not everyone is an expert learner. Second, learning specialists are still teasing out what works best for learning. So how are our students, or how are we ourselves, possibly going to already have all the answers about how to learn? Third, no matter how good we are at something, we can always learn more and develop existing skills to a higher level. Fourth, I'd rather my students leave me with the skills for self-learning all the stuff I didn't teach them, and all the stuff I tried to teach them, but it just didn't work, and all the stuff yet to be discovered after they leave me. Better to learn those skills of self-learning than to be focusing solely on a box of concepts and leave it at that. Another reason I'm talking to you, a teacher, right now about flashcards, especially all these nifty options and tricks and optional strategies, is that we can have them ready to dispense from our pedagogical pharmacy when a student comes knocking asking for help. I mentioned in the previous episode, episode 58, that a former professor used a chat with me and my study buddy to diagnostically probe what had gone wrong leading up to our dismal failure in an ecology class. Remember that test that blew up and sank to the bottom? That diagnostic probing and subsequent recommendation by our professor to use flashcards as a sort of pedagogical treatment plan is something I took to heart back then as a student. But I also started using that approach when I began teaching. Yeah, flashcards are probably good for 99% of learners. So we professors can safely prescribe flashcards for any student without knowing anything about that student, or their learning strategies or habits, or if they even have any learning strategies or habits. And we'll know that learning will improve if they use flashcards. It's like when a physician prescribes exercise. Exercise helps almost every kind of malady, right? And it prevents a whole bunch of problems too. But I still want my physician to ask me probing questions, maybe do a test or two if necessary, and thoughtfully consider my diagnosis and suggest a treatment plan that will help me. That may include exercise. Hey, it's probably going to include exercise. But even so, I know that it'll be specific to all of my needs at the time. So what I'm recommending is that we take that approach when dealing with students. The therapy model, where we work with individuals and try to figure out what's not working and then formulate a plan to get it working. And like exercise being recommended in medical therapy, flashcards are likely to be part of what we recommend to our students. But here's where all those bells and whistles come in. If we, as teachers, know a lot of different options and approaches to using flashcards, our prescription of a treatment plan will be a lot more effective. That's because we can give specific suggestions to try based on that student's particular case. So in a way, this discussion about the details and options of using flashcards is helping us become better learning therapists when our students seek out our advice. Something else I want to build on from episode 58, where we started the discussion of flashcards, is that it's best to remember that Flash is the goal. It's not the learning mode. Recall from that previous discussion that researchers have found that flashcards are often used too fast by students, which makes them less effective for learning. But that's in the learning phase. We want to work through that learning phase over days or maybe even weeks and finally get to what, we could call it the flash point, the point at which we can flash or fly through each one quickly because we've already accomplished our learning goals. I also want to mention that in the preview to this episode, that is preview episode number 59, we clarified the use of the terms obverse and reverse relative to flashcards. So you might want to go back and catch that if you happen to doze off during the preview of this episode, episode number 59. Yet another idea already mentioned in episode 58, but that I want to emphasize again, is that students should start making flashcards from the very start of a new topic in class. They ought not wait until they are done learning a topic and are cramming for a test. But we know that that's how many students use flashcards. For them, studying is something you do right before a test. It's not the underlying practice of learning that forms the foundation of each and every day of the semester that it must be if they're going to be successful. So we need to do what we can to get them on the right track regarding ongoing learning practice that starts from the get-go. I also recommend the practice of doing flashcard reviews regularly and in short bursts. The first thing I learned as a wild animal trainer, something you may recall I did very early in life, is that training new behaviors and practicing old behaviors just won't work unless it's done in very short sessions. I've found that there's a time limit on the cognitive load of learning that, if exceeded, can do more harm to learning than good. Like many things about teaching that I first learned as a lion tamer, a few short sessions every day can do a lot of good without all that much effort. Not only that, but it can actually be a fun challenge when learning is practiced this way, that is, in short sessions. As we wind up the second full year of the A&P Professor podcast, it's a good time for reflection. Remember, in episode 17, I advocated that we all do debriefings or reflections at the end of each academic year. So it's not surprising I'm doing that now with this podcast. Part of that process for me this year is gathering feedback from you. So I'm asking you for about 5 minutes of your time to fill out a survey. It's put together by a team of specialists to help me tweak and improve things. No matter if you're a new listener or a long-time listener, whether you've listened to just one episode or just part of an episode or listened to all the episodes, I'd really appreciate your time to respond to this anonymous survey. Just go to theapprofessor.org/survey. Let's get to some specific flashcard tips, tricks, and strategies. First, an important idea about flashcards that underlies all these strategies. That is, the idea that terms represent concepts. Terms aren't just words. They have meaning. And that meaning is the concept that each word or phrase represents. I think that when we recognize this, we can easily see past the mistaken notion that learning terms, and by extension, learning with flashcards, is somehow rote memorization without meaning. Well, okay, I guess it can be rote memorization without meaning. I guess what I'm trying to get at is it doesn't have to be, as long as we do some metacognition. That is, as long as we do some thinking about our thinking and take note of the deep meaning behind the representation of ideas on our flashcards. One common strategy that I haven't really gone into much is the use of pictures on flashcards. Some concepts lend themselves more to this than others. One that pops into mind right now is histology. I want my students to be able to recognize some of the key types of tissue visually. This comes early in the A&P1 course, and it often hits students right in the face. It's hard gaining the skills needed to recognize countless different examples of the same tissue type. They all look like abstract art anyway, don't they? Yeah, it's like a Jackson Pollock painting with all these, paint drips all over the place. At least when you're first starting, it doesn't seem to make any sense at first. I've been there, done that as a student myself. But as you know from your own learning of histology, the more you practice recognizing tissues, the easier it gets, until you can do it in your sleep, like during those occasional histology nightmares. What? I can't be the only one to get the odd histology nightmare now and again. Now, getting back to the point, recognizing tissues, bones, bone markings, muscles, nerves, vessels, just about any anatomical structure is something that pretty much requires a visual approach. Now, one way to produce these visual flashcards, if a student is making them rather than purchasing or downloading them, is to draw the visual elements. Drawing is a great way to learn while making the cards. And it's likely to have more meaning as the drawings are used in daily review. Another method is to print out images found on the internet or scanned from the textbook or lab atlas. Then the image can be taped or pasted onto one side of a flashcard. So the obverse could have the name of the structure and the reverse could have the picture. Or the picture could be on the obverse and then the name of the structure could be on the reverse. As a matter of fact, the same card can be used both ways, obviously, but it's how you approach the card, which one's going to be the obverse or front side and which is going to be the reverse or back side. Now, considering how ubiquitous mobile devices with built-in cameras have become, I've seen a lot of students taking photos of lab models, dissection specimens, microscope views, teaching charts, and even my diagrams on the whiteboard, and then making flashcards with them. And what about mnemonics? As you know, a mnemonic device is anything that helps you remember something. So in a way, flashcards by their very nature are themselves mnemonic devices. But usually when we think of mnemonics, we think of simple phrases or sentences where each word's starting letter is the same starting letter of a member of a list of things we're trying to remember, like the order of the 12 classic cranial nerves. So students could incorporate mnemonic phrases into their flashcards. For example, they could put the term or concept on the obverse and then put the mnemonic device with its meaning, that is, the actual list they're trying to learn, on the reverse of the card. Or they could put the mnemonic sentence with no clarifications on the obverse and the actual list to be learned on the reverse. Now, I'm going to circle back to another strategy in just a minute or two. But before I do, let's talk about color coding. For those of us with so-called normal color vision, color can be a powerful visual tool in helping us to learn. Besides simple memorization, using color coding can help us learn to categorize ideas and see relationships, thus moving us into higher level thinking and deeper understanding. There are a lot of different ways to use color coding with flashcards. Enough different ways that not only could that topic be its own episode, It could be its own podcast series. So clearly, I'm only going to be able to scratch the surface. Oh, no, wait. How about if I draw the rough outline and you color in the details yourself? Okay, stop groaning. That's not a pun. It's a metaphor. One general way to apply color coding to flashcards is to use different color cards. As you know, these are easily available to students. I'm still waiting to see index cards available in my favorite color, though. My favorite color is plaid. I can't be the only one, right? You'd think somebody would have come up with plaid index cards by now. Another way to use color coding is to use different colors of pen or pencil within a single card. Now, all mine are green because, well, I always carry a green pen with me. As a matter of fact, sitting right next to my microphone are, 4 green pens. I talked about green pens back in episode 6 if you want to hear why I use them. But one does have the option of using a variety of colors of pen or even highlighter when color coding information within a flashcard. And one could use colored index cards and colored pens or pencils and or highlighters, so you can have all kinds of colors going on. Now, if you're using plaid index cards, that may not work. That might be too many colors. Of course, all this begs the question, what exactly are we coding here? How are we applying color coding? Well, there's all kinds of possibilities. We could color code cards by topic, which might help in keeping them all organized in a big box like we talked about last time. Or a student could use different colors for text-based cards and those that primarily use an image. So you have text cards all one color and image cards all another color. Or you could have all the histology flashcards be one color. You're going to have histology flashcards mixed in with almost any topic in A&P, right? So if they're all one color, then you can pull out those histology flashcards right away. Or anatomy cards could be a different color than physiology cards. Or we can use color coding for different levels of importance or complexity. There's, really an unlimited variety of different kinds of categorization to which we can apply color coding. It's whatever an individual student finds to be most helpful in their own efforts to construct their own conceptual framework of A&P. Which brings us to another option for using flashcards. That is, adding layers of information. In episode 58, I talked about keeping flashcards simple at first, but then adding more layers of information as learning continues, as that module in the semester unfolds, or as that semester unfolds, or as the next semester unfolds. I like to use a constructivist model of learning, where I think of students learning A&P, or learning anything really, as if they're constructing a framework of knowledge, which we can call a conceptual framework. When we plan out our story of human structure and function, that is, when we design our course, we usually start out with some simple foundational ideas, like what chemicals are and how they work. We explain the basic ideas of acid and bases, and then survey some major groups of biochemicals and all kinds of core topics within chemistry. And then we come back to that later and add a layer of knowledge and understanding when we talk about what those biomolecules are doing in the cell. And add yet another layer when we get to the tissues, and then to each organ of each system. So for 2 semesters, we're adding layer by layer. In other words, we don't explore the concept of protein, for example, all at once. A student's understanding of the concept of protein evolves and grows each time it's encountered in a new context, in a new chapter of the story we've planned out in our course. We can call this layering, or we can call it interleaving, or we can call it a spiraling curriculum, or we can call it constructing a conceptual framework. Goes by a lot of names, but it's a real basic idea of learning. Doesn't really matter what we call it, I guess, as long as we're doing it. My point here is that students can add layers of content to their flashcards to reflect this manner of learning. This practice becomes a concrete reflection of the learning process going on inside a student's mind. It also promotes a student going back to review what they know and understand about the concept already, thus reinforcing prior learning. Beyond that, I think this practice of adding layers of content to flashcards also promotes thinking about connections between concepts, thus forming those interconnecting crossbeams that strengthen a student's conceptual framework as it's being built up. And here's a spot where we could add color coding within a card. The first entry on the reverse of a flashcard could be a simple definition. That could be kept near the top edge of the card and be highlighted in yellow. And then as more information is added below, either not highlighted or highlighted in a different color or written with a different color pen or pencil, it would stand out. That core information would be easily identifiable at the top in its own color, and the added layers of information would be slightly separated, but all there on the same card. A lot of my students add other kinds of information to their flashcard. For example, references to chapter number, to page number, to figure number, or table number in their textbook, or in their lab manual, or both. I've even seen students move out of A&P into nursing or some other program and pull out their A&P flashcards and start adding cross-references to their nursing theory textbooks or their clinical care references. Some students use cross-references to other cards in their growing collection. Besides adding layers of information, I've seen students add physical layers to their flashcards. For example, when using mnemonic sentences. On the obverse, they'll identify some sort of list like the cranial nerves. Then on the reverse, they'll have the mnemonic. Then they either confirm that they got the answer correctly before flipping over the flashcard, or they'll now try to derive the actual nerve names using the mnemonic that's on the reverse. To check themselves at that point, they'll flip up a little flap that they've made on the reverse by taping a partial card to the bottom half of the reverse side. Under that flap is where they'll have the actual list of nerves. So that makes it sort of a two-tiered flashcard. So that's what I mean by adding physical layers to the flashcards. That allows us more room and more ways to use the added layers of information. So it makes it sort of kind of like a two-step flashcard. Yep, I did it again. I went on and on about flashcards. And once again, there's more to tell. That's okay though, because there's another episode coming in a couple of weeks. I can pick up the story then, right? Of course, the problem with that scenario is that between now and then, I'll have thought of even more to say about flashcards, thus making it necessary to go on for yet another episode after the next one. I'll try to be careful though. I guess anything extra I have on flashcards after the next episode can wait in my file for a while, along with all those other ideas have their waiting to be used on some new episode further along in the future. Oh, wait. In the last episode, I promised some amazing feats with flashcards, like levitating flashcards, and I don't want to leave you disappointed. If you go to the TAP app on your device, which you can install by going to your device's app store and searching for the A&P Professor, or just clicking the link in the show notes or the episode page at theapprofessor.org/59, and you'll see there's a bonus video there that shows you exactly how to get a flashcard to levitate. Really. Check it out. And if you hang on in the video past the blackout at the end, that's where I reveal the secret. So don't turn it off too quick or you won't know how to do it yourself. Don't forget that I always put links in the show notes and at the episode page at theapprofessor.org in case you want to further explore any ideas mentioned in this podcast or if you want to visit our sponsors. And you're always encouraged to call in with your questions, comments, and ideas at the podcast hotline. 1-833-LION-DEN. That's 1-833-546-6336. Or send a recording or written message to podcast@theapprofessor.org. I'll see you down the road.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Dr. Kevin Patton, an award-winning professor and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
Putting this podcast in the microwave is not recommended. Support for this episode comes from the American Association of Anatomists, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, and the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction. Hey there, friend. The podcast episode's over. Now it's time to turn the volume down a bit and settle in for the Delta Wave Radio Hour. I'm your host, Dr. Z. Don't forget, my dear friend, that we do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Before I play you a dreamlike track by REM, I have something special here, dedicated to listeners Dick and Ellen, who tune in from all the way up there in Calgary. Here it is, with a smooth Atlanta sound from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It's called Influenza. What is influenza, or the flu? Well, flu is a contagious respiratory illness caused by influenza virus that infect the nose, throat, and sometimes the lungs. Influenza, or flu, can cause mild to severe illness and at times can lead to death. Flu is different from a cold. Flu usually comes on suddenly. People who have flu often feel some or all of these symptoms: fever or feeling feverish or chills. It's important to note that not everyone with flu will have a fever, or cough, or sore throat, runny or stuffy nose, muscle or body aches, headaches, fatigue or tiredness. Some people may have vomiting and diarrhea, although this is more common in children than adults. Most experts believe that flu viruses spread mainly by tiny droplets made when people with the flu cough, sneeze, or talk. These droplets can land in the mouths or noses of people who are nearby. Less often, a person might get flu by touching a surface or object that has flu virus on it, and then touching their own mouth, nose, or possibly their eye. A 2018 CDC study published in Clinical Infectious Disease looked at the percentage of the U.S. population who were sickened by flu using two different methods and compared the findings. Both methods had similar findings, which suggested that, on average, about 8% of the U.S. population gets sick from flu each season, with a range of between 3% and 11%. Depending on the season. The same CID study found that children are most likely to get sick from flu, and that people 65 and older are least likely to get sick from influenza. Median incidence values, or attack rate by age group, were 9.3% for children, 0 to 17 years, 8.8% for adults, 18 to 64 years, and 3.9% for adults 65 years and older. This means that children younger than 18 are more than twice as likely to develop a symptomatic flu infection than adults 65 and over. You may be able to spread flu to someone else before you know you're sick, as well as while you are sick. People with flu are most contagious in the first 3 or 4 days after their illness begins. Some otherwise healthy adults may be able to infect others beginning 1 day before symptoms develop and up to 5 to 7 days after becoming sick. Some people, especially young children and people with weakened immune systems, might be able to infect others for an even longer time. The time from when a person is exposed and infected with flu to when symptoms begin is about 2 days, but it can range from about 1 to 4 days. Complications of the flu can include bacterial pneumonia, ear infections, sinus infections, and worsening of chronic medical conditions such as congestive heart failure, asthma, or diabetes. Anyone can get flu, even healthy people. And serious problems related to flu can happen at any age. But some people are at high risk of developing serious flu-related complications if they get sick. This includes people 65 years and older, people of any age with certain chronic medical conditions, pregnant women, and children younger than 5 years. The first and most important step in preventing flu is to get a flu vaccine each year. Flu vaccine has been shown to reduce flu-related illnesses and the risk of serious flu complications that can result in hospitalization or even death. CDC also recommends everyday preventive actions, like staying away from people who are sick, covering coughs and sneezes, and frequent hand washing to help slow the spread of germs that cause respiratory, that is, nose, throat, and lung illnesses, like flu. It's very difficult to distinguish flu from other viral or bacterial respiratory illnesses based on symptoms alone. There are tests available to diagnose flu. There's more information available from cdc.gov.